Chapter 20. In Search of Relaxation. It was nearing midnight, and I had just dismissed the Central Committee, which meets each Tuesday evening at my house to discuss party affairs and policy. Topsy, my black spaniel who had been my companion for the past 12 months, now shook herself awake to take on her adopted role of bodyguard and sentry. Standing at the top of the flight of stairs, she made sure that everybody went down them. When she was satisfied, she pushed her way through the door that I was on the point of shutting, and insisted on nosing around the various rooms to check that I was at last alone. As she went into the dining room, I followed her, intending to get a glass of water. Then, on the table, I noticed that my supper was still laid out for me. I uncovered the dish and helped myself to some of the now cold and somewhat unappetizing fish stew. I noticed that the ants had already settled themselves into the pieces of bread that had been left for me, and I sat and watched them as I ate. Nothing will stop them, I thought, as I watched those minute creatures running purposefully backwards and forwards to the bread. They will always succeed in their objective because they are disciplined and organized. There was not a single slacker among them. Topsy shifted herself so that I would divert my attention to her. I looked down into her mournful-looking eyes and smiled. Breaking my rule, I handed her a piece of fish from my plate, which she swallowed like a pill. I sat and thought over the events of the day and realized that I had been on the go for 24 hours out of 24. During that time, I had held a cabinet meeting, a meeting of chief regional officers, a number of official interviews at the office, and the day-to-day business there. I had advised on many problems for the men and women who were waiting for me at the party headquarters and at my house, and then, to round off the day, there had been the meeting of the Central Committee. And yet it had not been an exceptional day. Each day of my life was like that now. Sometimes it was even worse. I dragged myself to my feet and thanked God that I could now get to bed. Suddenly, Topsy ran to the front door, barking furiously as she tried to get out. I had no need to wonder what the matter was. She had heard strange footsteps, and it was my bet that there was a woman around somewhere. For some reason, she could not bear a woman to come to the house unless she was very familiar with her. There was a knock at my door. Who on earth is here at this time of night? I wondered as I undid the latch. The caller had already backed halfway down the steps on hearing Topsy's noisy objections to his knock, but I managed to quieten her. The man came up, took off his sandals, and started to kneel before me. "Put on your sandals," I said to him kindly. "Come and sit down here and tell me what the matter is." I indicated one of the chairs to him and sat myself in another opposite him. "It is about my wife, Kwame Nkrumah," he began. "We've travelled 120 miles to see you, and maybe tomorrow will be too late. So we have come tonight." "Where is your wife, and what is the matter?" I asked him. "She is down in the yard. He told me that she was expecting a child, but that the time for her to give birth had passed several weeks ago. They had come all the way to see me because they knew that I was the only person who could help her," he told me. Wondering what was expected of me, I told him to go and bring his wife. "Don't worry," I told her, placing my hand gently on her body. "Your child will be born very shortly and you will have no trouble. Have faith." They went away grateful and happy. The following day, I received word from the man that his wife had given birth to a male child that very morning, and that they wanted to name him Kwame Nkrumah. I wondered to myself, how many Kwame Nkrumahs there must be in the country. None of them are in any relation to me, and most of them I have never set eyes on. If the history of the Gold Coast is not soon written, I feared, I shall go down on record as being a most prolific man. I was truly glad to get to bed that night, and sleep overtook me before I had even managed to get properly undressed. A couple of hours later, I woke up sneezing. I had caught a cold again from falling asleep in a state of half undress. Apart from catching pneumonia in the United States, I have never had a day's illness that I remember, but I can catch a cold almost quicker than I draw breath. At 4 in the morning, I was awakened by the telephone ringing at my bedside. One of my ministers wanted to see me on a matter of urgency. Okay, I told him. You can come now. I'll open the door for you. By the time he left, it was nearly 5 o'clock, and I was preparing to read through the files and papers that I had brought from the office when I was told that some people were sitting outside waiting to see me. I went out to find a young man and woman sitting some distance apart and rather obviously not on speaking terms. This time, it was matrimonial trouble. Both of them had much to say against each other, and they were both talking at once. I put up my hand to silence them and gave them the best and most sensible advice that a bachelor could be expected to know on such matters. Soon they quietened down and agreed to give each other and things another try. Then another figure appeared at the top of the stairs, an elderly woman. Kwame Nkrumah, I give you myself, body and soul, only please give me some money for my chop, which is food, she said. I laughed. What do you think I want with you? I chided her. Here you are. This is all I've got. I went back to the library and worked until about 7:30 and went to have a bath and prepare myself to go to the office. As I was sitting in the bath scrubbing myself, a voice suddenly said at the bathroom door, Excuse me, excuse me. I was flabbergasted. Has a man no privacy? I thought, even in his bath. But I managed to control my irritation somehow. Can you possibly wait outside until I finish my bath? I asked. Too kindly, it appeared. The matter is so urgent, Kwame Nkrumah. The man would not be put off. He stood where he was, though just out of sight, and I was pleased to note. And then he poured out his troubles to the accompaniment of splashing water. I advised him on what I felt to be the best course of action, and he went away. Hearing a buzz of conversation in the immediate vicinity, however, I called after him to kindly shut the front door behind him and to tell anybody else who was waiting to see me that I would be out in 10 minutes. After listening to problems on a variety of subjects, I eventually managed to tear myself away to keep my official appointments at the office. On the way, I remembered that I had had no breakfast. On arrival at the office, I asked my personal secretary, Erica Powell, if she could get me a glass of water. Haven't you had any breakfast again, Prime Minister? She asked. No, I was too busy. I forgot it. Then I'll get you some coffee and biscuits, she said, after reminding me once again of the important role that food played in keeping body and soul together, and it affects your mind too, she added. Somehow or other, I did not feel my usual self these days. I was constantly feeling tired, not so much physically as mentally. My lack of regular meals and proper diet certainly may have had something to do with it, but apart from that, I felt an almost urgent need to escape, to break away from the routine of my life and to be able to have a few hours to myself, occasionally for reflection. The cabinet recess was due to take place in September, and several of the ministers had already left the country for various missions overseas, or were planning a spot of leave. Why shouldn't I take some leave? I asked myself. The idea had several times occurred to me at one time and another, but I had never allowed it to materialize. Just at that moment, however, Daniel Chapman, secretary to the cabinet, came into my office. I was just thinking, I said. Why don't I take some leave? Daniel was most enthusiastic about the project. He was ready with his pad and pencil to make the necessary arrangements just as soon as I could make my mind up in regards to where I would go. I suggested some sea air and said I thought it would be rather nice to cruise down the coast for a couple of weeks. Excellent idea, said Daniel as he made a note of it. I will make some inquiries at the various shipping companies straight away and find out whether there is a boat sailing for a round trip at the beginning of September, as he rushed out of the front door. I called him back. By the way, I said, I have much work that I shall want to get through. Work that necessitates peaceful surroundings. I shall need both you and Erica on this trip, and I suggest that you take Efua, Mrs. Chapman, along with you. It will be a good change for her if she can manage to leave the children behind. I could see that Daniel was as good as on board the boat, and I noticed that he went into Erica's office to tell her the news before he got down to making the arrangements. And so it happened that the four of us, together with my nephew Nyamake, who has been a necessary part of my household for some years now, arranged to board the Dutch merchant vessel Nigerstrom at Takoradi and travel as far as Douala in the French Cameroons and back, a trip of about a fortnight to 3 weeks. I wanted to sneak quietly away, but it was pointed out to me that prime ministers just can't suddenly disappear without warning. I was reminded of the time when I disappeared the previous year for a week to a quiet spot about 100 miles or so outside of Accra in order to meditate. It was a personal matter and one from which I have always derived benefit, and I saw no reason to announce to the world where I was going. The only people who were told were the governor and the commissioner of police, but the British press made such announcements as Gold Coast Premier disappears, Kwame Nkrumah vanishes, and gave wild and imaginative accounts of my probable visit to a juju man. All right, I agreed. You can issue a press release, but it must not go out until I have set sail, and no mention must be made of the name of the boat or its destination. You can just say that the Prime Minister has gone on a short sea trip. I have often wondered why we bother to waste time in issuing carefully worded statements to the press. The ubiquitous Bush telegraph system soon announced that the details of my trip, and by the time I arrived in Takoradi, the date and time of my departure of the Nigerstrom had already become a matter of importance to the Gold Coast people. Because of the crowds that were managing to leak into the dock area and were standing patiently on the quayside, it was arranged that I should board the boat from a launch which would come from the opposite side of the harbour. I said that I would arrive at 8:30 in the evening of the day before the boat was due to sail. A number of party members had come to me in Takoradi and were anxious to see me on the boat, so the captain must have got something of a shock to see about 30 people following me out of the launch and up the gangway. To allay his fears, I told him that a few of my friends had expressed a wish to see me on board and to take a look at my cabin. Of course, sir, he said with a smile as he shook my hand and welcomed me aboard. Then he called the chief steward and asked that my companions should be shown my cabin. They all trooped down the long corridor to the last cabin. When they were shown inside, I heard several gasps of admiration. Although it was well appointed and a very roomy cabin, I wondered at their enthusiasm until I got further inside. Then I saw the cause of it all. On the dressing table was an enormous bouquet of gay flowers, attached to which was a note wishing me welcome and bon voyage from the shipping company, the Holland West Africa Lin. After this, we all congregated in the lounge, where drinks were served, and we sat and chatted until the time came for the guests to leave the boat. As soon as the engine started around 5 o'clock the following morning, I was up and dressed and wandering around the deck. A voice called to me from somewhere, and it said, "Mr. Prime Minister, come up if you like. You can get a good view of Takoradi Harbour and see how we pilot the boat out to sea." It was the captain. A few seconds later, I was standing with him on the bridge and learning everything that a novice could expect to know about the piloting and steering of a ship. As soon as we were under way, the captain took me to his cabin where we sat and chatted about boats until a bell sounded. "What is that?" I asked when I heard the bell. "That's for breakfast, sir. I'm afraid I am not always very good company first thing in the morning, so I have formed the habit of having my breakfast up here on a tray," the captain remarked, somewhat apologetically. "You are lucky," I declared. "I very rarely get any at all. A Prime Minister has to work hard. I've just realized that this is the first vacation I have ever taken. The captain raised his eyebrows. Well, you must take things easy while you're aboard my ship, he said. Then, with a twinkle in his eye, but in the commanding voice, he declared, and as captain of this ship, I will make sure that you do. The steward brought in the captain's breakfast and I got to my feet and went to join the others. The dining room was just next to my cabin. Daniel, Ephra, and Erica were all seated around the table, surrounded by food. What's all this? I inquired, pointing at the plate of smoked meats, some queer-looking fish, and an assortment of other strange-looking fare. And where's Nyamake? He's discovered a Gold Coast boy on board and wants to have meals with him elsewhere, Daniel informed me. There was so much for breakfast that I thought it would keep me going for the rest of the trip. Luckily, I had managed to work up a bit of an appetite with the fresh air and sea breeze on the bridge. I noticed that Ephua was very quiet and asked her what was the matter. She smiled, not a happy smile, but a brave attempt. Then she suddenly jumped up from the table and rushed to her cabin. Poor Ephua, we chorused. But it's so calm, I declared in amazement. We learned, however, that just as soon as the boat left the dockside, however still the water might be, Ephua felt the ripples of it, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. After breakfast, I roamed the decks again. I couldn't accustom myself to the idea that I had simply nothing to do all day, nobody to worry me with problems, and no telephone bells to distract me. I had bought a couple of books along with me, and I also intended on doing something about writing this book, but I felt that they could wait. Just then I was so determined to try and enjoy this relaxation, but I had heard so much about it. After I had circled the decks about half a dozen times, leaned on the rails and examined the sea, scanned the horizon for a glimpse of my native land, and peered inquisitively into various doorways leading off from the deck, each of which seemed to house some officer or other, I must say I felt that I had done pretty well all that there was to be done on the Niger-Strom, and I was beginning to have my doubts about being able to amuse myself for another 14 days or so. Suddenly Erica appeared around a corner, looking, I thought, also at a loose end. Hello, Prime Minister. We wondered where you had got to. I've been walking around the deck. I think I'll go and lie down in my cabin and read. You can't very well go now, she said, because they're cleaning it. Why don't you read your book up here, or in the lounge? She went off to get my book while I arranged a chair for myself. The morning slipped by, and around midday the captain came along. How's the relaxation going? He asked. I don't know, Captain. I'm not used to lying around like this all day. I think you'll have to find me a job before this trip is over. Can you play darts? He asked. I've never tried. Well, come along and have a game. I always play against the first officer before lunch. It's my daily exercise, and so each noon the captain and I, with the first officer, the Dutch consul in Nigeria, who had been asked by the Dutch authorities to accompany me on the trip, Daniel or Erica, or whoever else happened to be around when we needed a fourth player, paired up and played against each other. Losers buy the beer, the captain would announce. These gatherings round the dartboard each lunchtime are quite my happiest moments and memories of the trip. The following morning, the boat docked at Lagos. Again I went up to the bridge and watched the pilot come aboard at the entrance of the harbour mouth to take the boat safely through the tricky mud banks and shallow waters. Soon after we docked, the ADC to the Governor General of Nigeria and the Chief Secretary came aboard to extend a welcome on behalf of Sir James Robertson and asked if I would care to have tea at Government House that afternoon. I accepted, and on the return trip to Lagos I had lunch there, when I had a long and useful chat with the Governor General on current affairs of mutual interest. On each occasion I was transported by the Government House launch. Word soon got round that I was on board, and people lined the quayside day and night expecting me to come ashore. Because so many tried to come aboard to speak to me, a policeman had to be stationed at the top of the gangway. I wanted very much to go ashore and say a few words to the expectant crowds, but I realized that this might cause embarrassment to the government of Nigeria since I was on an unofficial visit. I hoped that the people would understand, and I asked that the facts should be explained to them in local newspapers. But I had to find a way to visit Mr. W. Biney, who had done so much to help me with my passage money to the United States about 20 years earlier. So one night his son came and collected the four of us and took us out to Yaba, where he lived. He was now an old man and was not in very good health, but he was delighted to see me again and we had a long chat together. He had a private zoo in his garden, and I was most amused to find a large chimpanzee sitting under the house, smoking a cigarette like an old man and obviously enjoying every puff. On my return to Lagos, I paid another visit to the house, and this time a number of his friends who were all known to me were invited. It was a happy gathering, and the old man seemed to be filled with new life as he watched us dancing the Gold Coast high life to the music of his radiogram. The Nigerian Port Authority representatives took me on a tour of inspection to the wharves and warehouses, and then by launch round the harbour to watch the dredgers at work and to see the dry dock. I noticed that there was a Japanese boat in the harbour and expressed a wish to see over it. The Japanese were very happy to show me around. The thing that impressed me the most about the ship was that at 5 feet 9 inches I had suddenly become too big to be comfortable. Every time I passed through a door, if I forgot to stoop, I was nearly decapitated. There was, of course, plenty of activity on board the Nigerstrom too, and I spent a lot of time watching the cranes hauling up the cargo out of the hold. It took 5 days to unload all there was, and at 5 o'clock in the afternoon we set sail for Douala. Crowds waved goodbye from the dockside, and there were many shouts of freedom and hands raised in the CPP Freedom Salute. There were no doubt many Gold Coast people among them. Before we reached Douala, a cable arrived from the governor asking me and my party to lunch. I replied that we would be pleased to accept the following day. Early in the morning of the 12th of September, we passed the island of Fernando Po. This is a very important island to us, I told the captain. Fernando Po? But it's Spanish, he retorted. I don't care about that. It was from there that our cocoa originated. Really? The captain said with interest. Yes. In 1879, a Gold Coast man from Christiansborg, Accra, called Tete Kwashi, returned home from Sao Tome in Fernando Po and brought with him a cocoa seed which he planted in Mampong. From that seed, our cocoa crop developed and has become our most important export. I hope I don't sound like a walking Encyclopedia Britannica, I added, but that is the story. 2 hours later, we arrived in Douala and I was most impressed to see the mechanically driven trolleys and cranes that were used to discharge cargo. I mentioned this to the French harbour official who took us in a launch on a tour of the harbour later in the day, and he declared proudly that Douala boasted the quickest turnaround of any port on the west coast of Africa. I couldn't believe it, too, for they got into action as soon as the boat docked and appeared to be hard at it all day and night. It was difficult to ignore them, in fact, for the whirring of engines and clanking of gears made this impossible. The British consul came on board to pay his respects, and I asked him tactfully about the political situation, for I had heard from time to time disturbing accounts and petitions from various political movements in the French Cameroons. He was unable to tell me very much, because he said he had not been in the country very long. I gathered from the French harbour official, who was otherwise non-committal on the subject, that there existed strong tribal feeling. He said that this was so prevalent that a few days previously one of the dock workers had fallen into the water and was unable to swim. He was screaming for assistance, but the rest of the men, because they were not of his tribe and were not sympathetic towards him, never moved a muscle to help him. In the end, the Frenchman forced one of the men to dive in and save him. I felt that this was the most distressing and unsatisfactory state of affairs in any country and hoped that I might be able to find out more from the governor at lunchtime. Rain was pouring down when 2 carloads of French officials arrived at the docks to escort us to the governor's residence. The driver of our car seemed to be tearing at breakneck speed, and after he missed, by mere centimeters, several pedestrians and cyclists, I felt I could no longer bear and called out, "Not so fast, driver." He took not the slightest notice, so thinking that he might be a little deaf, I shouted louder. At this time, he turned his head at a right angle and stared at me, and then returned his wandering gaze to the road again. Daniel laughed. "Of course, he can't understand you. He's French." By the time we had thought up what we wanted to say and how to say it in French, the race was over and our tires screeched once more as we turned into the gates of the governor's residence. In spite of the torrential rain, a guard of honor had been posted at the gates and we called past to acknowledge their salute. I was most impressed. The governor and his wife were at the steps to meet us and were very charming and welcoming. Fortunately, they both spoke good English, and I managed to have a long conversation with them. Both of them appeared to be very fond of the people and to have their cause at heart, but they carefully avoided answering any questions I asked about the political situation. I felt by this time that it was a matter of which was simply not discussed. The lunch was first class. Having had over a week on board the Niger encouraged by the captain and the chief steward to sample all the appetizing Dutch dishes, I was becoming quite food conscious and eating was becoming quite an enjoyable pastime. I have never tasted such wonderful fish as was served for one of the courses. I had 2 helpings in spite of the threatening array of knives and forks before me that promised more to follow than I would ever be able to cope with. That night, 2 newspaper reporters managed to get on board. They approached Erica first and she said that I was not available, but passed them on to Chapman. Daniel, because he felt so sorry for them, took them into the lounge and gave them a few drinks. In the meantime, Erica warned me that they were there and managed to smuggle me past the lounge door and up to the deck where I had to stay until they had gone. Even though I would have liked to see them, indeed I wanted to see them, for I knew that I would be able to find out what was going on in the country from them. I had to remember all the time that I was an unofficial visitor to the country and that I had to be cautious. It would have been embarrassing if I had been reported in the local papers giving my democratic views to a reporter, for this would have probably been misinterpreted by the French and British governments. The following morning we took the captain, the chief engineer and the Dutch consul up country to inspect a hydroelectric power station that was being built. I was especially interested to see this because of our own Volta River project. The journey took about 2 hours each way. It was a very humid day with intermittent showers, and the French were tireless in showing us all that there was to see. We followed them around power stations, to the top of the dam and over rough soil where new projects were being started. It was most interesting, but as soon as we grew hotter and thirstier, I sensed a feeling of unrest among some of the party. Then I heard the captain say to somebody as he looked at his watch, "I could certainly do with one myself." "So could I, Captain," I said, smiling. Then the Dutch consul, being the most diplomatic and speaking the most impeccable French, asked one of our hosts whether it was possible to buy some beer to refresh the party. The Frenchman looked quite taken aback and said that he doubted whether we would be able to get any around here. As I saw that the interest of my parched and weary party was dwindling in technical subjects, I said that I thought that we had better make a move as we had a long journey before us. One thing that I remember very vividly about the occasion, probably because it was the first time that I have ever seen it happen in any colony, was the way all the workers, both European and African, climbed into the waiting lorries when the lunch buzzer sounded. This complete disregard of color on the part of the European workers greatly impressed me. It seemed no time at all before we were on our way back to Takoradi. Luckily, there was a lot of cocoa to be loaded at Accra, so I had the opportunity of watching my countrymen paddling out in the surf to the boats anchored off Accra, a distance of about a mile and extremely hard going in heavy surf to load great bags of cocoa. Sometimes bags would drop into the sea and I became concerned at our loss of revenue, but the captain assured me that everyone was picked up by the surf boats, which was true. One man in each boat would climb up the side of the ship with the aid of a rope and get his consignment note signed by the officer supervising the loading. It was remarkable to watch the agility of these men, but more remarkable than ever to see how little they ate. A mere handful of rice or gari. It was a miracle that they had the strength to carry out such an arduous job. These men should have an issue of vitamins, I said to Daniel, who was quite also watching over the rail. You're quite right, he said. According to a doctor friend of mine, although they have such strength and appear to be vigorous and healthy, they have no resistance at all against disease. Something must be done about it as soon as possible, I said. Schools, hospitals, child welfare, libraries, yes, all of vital importance, but how many people stop to consider men such as these, developing huge muscles through the weights they carried and the surf that they battled against, appearing on the face of it as strong and healthy men, and yet they died young as soon as disease overtook them. Their place was taken by others, and so it would go on, year after year. Has anyone given the matter a thought? I felt once again the urgent need to implement my party's social policy and to improve the economic standards and working conditions such as these. If things had gone according to schedule, we should have landed in Takoradi on my birthday. However, we spent one more day off Accra because it rained, and the surf was apparently too bad for the boats to load the Niger stream. At midday, the fishing boats set out, a most picturesque sight, with their white sails dazzling in the bright sun. They would be out all night fishing in the deep waters. Nkrumah's fleet, said the captain who came up beside me and must have been reading my thoughts. Yes, my fleet, I answered proudly. Good luck to them. That is the foundation of a navy, you know, the captain said as we watched them disappearing over the horizon. The following day the surf boats were at work again, and the captain told us that all being well, we would be sailing for Takoradi that evening. As it was my birthday, I invited the captain and his officers to drink champagne before lunch. There was a touch of sadness about the gathering in the lounge that day, which even the champagne failed to dispel. I played my last darts match with a somewhat heavy heart. When dinner time came, I decided that because it was my birthday and because it was the last night of the holiday, I would wear a dinner jacket. It was a last minute idea, and when I poked my nose into Dan's cabin to tell him, his face fell, for he said that he had already packed his. I had no idea of what was in store for me, but as things turned out, I was very pleased that I had decided to dress for the occasion. When I entered the dining room, the first thing I noticed was that our usual table was no longer there. Then I saw that there was only one table in the room, one long table down the center and most beautifully decorated. The chief steward, always full of wit and humour, met me as I entered and ushered me to the place of honour at one end of the table with the captain at the other end. The meal was superb, and every dish presented was so colourful and so beautifully arranged that it seemed sheer sacrilege to disturb it. The crowning glory was a magnificent birthday cake which I had to cut. At the end of the meal, the captain rose to his feet and said that he would like to say a few words. Mr. Prime Minister, he began, I am going to be quite frank with you. When we heard that we were going to have a Prime Minister and his party aboard, we didn't like it. We didn't like it at all. But all I can say, Dr. Nkrumah, is that we have all, every one of us, been genuinely happy to have had you with us. We are glad and honoured to have met you and to have got to know you, and we hope that whenever you take another sea trip, you will choose to travel again with us on the Niger stream. Here's to your success and to our next meeting, he said as he raised his glass. There was sincerity in these words. Everyone had indeed been more kind to us, and I was so conscious of this fact that I wanted to give them each something to remember us by. I sent Efua and Erica to shop when we were in Lagos, and they returned with a silver tankard for each of them. I felt that this was something that I could not have chosen better, for they could use them during that pleasurable hour before lunch around the dartboard, the hour that I had grown to love. And so, after the captain had finished his speech, I stood up and said a few words of thanks, and then presented a tankard to him and to each of his officers. My only regret was that in the short space of time it had not been possible for us to get them inscribed. We arrived at Takoradi at 2 in the morning, and we stayed on the bridge with the captain until the boat had been safely anchored outside the harbour entrance. The following day, after I had made a tour of inspection of the harbour, I bade farewell to the captain and his officers, and stepped into the launch that was to take me ashore. I certainly weighed a good few pounds more than when I had embarked 2 weeks previously. As we moved away and sorrowfully waved our farewells to the Nigerstrom and her crew, 3 blasts sounded from the ship. I was deeply touched, and turned my head away towards the shore. The whole of the quayside was thick with people, so that it was a job to get a foothold beyond the stone steps leading up from the launch. When I eventually reached my car, it was almost as if it was carried by the people through the streets of Takoradi, so close were they. Then the people kept struggling to see me, so I decided to get out of the car and to continue the journey standing in an open jeep where I could acknowledge their welcome more easily. The people had arranged reception committees and a mass meeting in the afternoon, followed by a grand reception at night, but as I was anxious to return to Accra the same day, I addressed the crowd from a balcony and explained to them my disappointment at not being able to present throughout the celebrations that they had arranged for me. Then I left for Accra early in the afternoon. I travelled back with Kojo Botsio, who had come to meet me, and during the journey he told me all that had been happening while I was away. How different I felt. My old enthusiasm had returned, and I had more energy than I knew how to expend. You know, Kojo, I said as I interrupted his discourse, we must do something about getting a yacht.